Hi, good morning. Sorry about the few minutes of tardiness. Thank you for joining us this morning for the panel entitled A Lost Lady, Readings Reframed. Today we have three spectacular presentations for you. I'm just going to go ahead and introduce each of the speakers, and then they can in turn then go ahead and present. All right, so the first, excuse me. That's better. All right, hi. You want me to say that whole thing again? Good morning and welcome. All right, so our first presenter is Bill Lord. Bill Lord retired from Iowa State University in 2002 as Distinguished Professor of Engineering Emeritus. He has been a regular reviewer for the National Science Foundation since 2002, and his current interests relate to the Institute for Senior Professionals program at the Northwest Florida State College and the Coast Guard Auxiliary in Destin, Florida. He is currently active as a member of both the Willa Cather Foundation and the Robert Henry Museum. Welcome. I'm just going to, can I go ahead and introduce, or you want me to keep? Okay. Our second presentation is by John Mickelson. John Mickelson is a professor of philosophy emeritus at Missouri Western State University, St. Joseph, Missouri. He was born in McCook, Nebraska, and grew up in Imperial, Gordon, Aurora, and Gothenburg before undergraduate study at Nebraska Wesleyan Vanderbilt and the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. He earned his doctorate from the University of Kansas in 1987 and was with a dissertation on Kant's Critique of Judgment. He is the translator and editor of Kant and the Concept of Race. Our final presentation will be given to us by Darrell W. Palmer. Darrell Palmer is a professor of English at Regis University in Denver, Colorado. His most recent book is Becoming Willa Cather, Creation and Career, and his articles on Willa Cather and the American West have appeared in journals such as American Literary Realism, Great Plains Quarterly, Kansas History, Theory and Event, and Willa Cather Review. So let's hear it for all our speakers.
Thank you and good morning. Libel laws have been around for a long time. They were introduced in the 1600s, partly to help reduce the common practice of dueling. While such a form of argument does produce a clear winner, it does not always ensure a correct result. Certainly, dueling would make for much more interesting presentations at this 150th birthday celebration, but would, I'm afraid, have a somewhat deleterious effect on the membership number. Laws relating to the torts of libel, defamation, and invasion of privacy have changed dramatically since the days of dueling, making it much more difficult to pursue in civil court. Written plagiarism is not a crime. In academic circles, it can result in loss of tenure in serious cases, or at least a loss of reputation. In literature, persona plagiarism, or the use of real people and real events from their lives, is widely used by authors, but its ramifications are less well understood. To illustrate this, a comparative study is presented in this paper of persona plagiarism in The Lost Lady and Women in Love. Both Willa Cather and David Herbert Lawrence were contemporaries who made extensive use of friends, family, neighbors, and acquaintances, generally without permission, in their works of supposed fiction. Ideally, authors and publishers work diligently to avoid the law by only writing kindly about dead people. You cannot libel a dead person, nor can you invade their privacy, obviously. one way around all of this, of course, is to change the names of people and places, and this is commonly done in literature. I want us now to kind of consider 4 scenarios in order for me to make the point I want to make about this. First of all, you can close your eyes if you wish, if you kind of like to concentrate on things in that manner. I should warn you, being a teacher for over 40 years, I will notice if you don't reopen them. First of all, imagine that it is 1923. You are living in the coal mining town of Eastwood, about 15 miles from Nottingham in the Midlands of England, and the birthplace of D.H. Lawrence. Your aunt, who emigrated to the United States, has just sent you the newly published A Lost Lady, as she feels you need to expand your literary horizons. You know nothing about Nebraska, where's the atlas, and even less about homesteading. Possible reactions. Wow, what a good read. Her description of the countryside and the people are remarkable, almost as good as Lawrence. I really learned a lot about Nebraska history and the rise and fall of the homesteading and railroad eras, paralleled by the rise and fall of Mrs. Forrester in Sweetwater. Would make a great movie. Okay, scene 2, Red Cloud. Imagine now that you've been living in Red Cloud, 1923 again, and you've just bought A Lost Lady to see how Cather has recovered from the less than enthusiastic reviews of one of ours. You immediately recognize Sweetwater as Red Cloud and the Forresters as the Garbers. Possible reactions. Wow, beautifully written as usual, and places our little town on the map. But why did Cather have to defame Mrs. Cather so? That is so unkind. Okay? Still in Red Cloud. This is scenario 3. After reading A Lost Lady, you are pleased to receive Women in Love from your great aunt in England, who feels you should be expanding your literary horizons. You know nothing about Eastwood and coal mining, are only vaguely aware of Nottingham's location and its relationship to the sheriff and Robin Hood. Reactions. Wow, what a great novel. His descriptions of the countryside around Beldover are almost as good as those of Cather and Nebraska, and his development of the 2 love stories nicely highlights the effects of classism and industrialization on the hoi polloi. Would make a great movie. Still in Eastwood. Meanwhile, back in coal country, Lawrence's latest literary effort, Women in Love, despite the censors, has seen print, and you're eager to see just who else he has chosen to vilify. You quickly recognize Beldover as Eastwood, Shortlands as Lamb Close, and Gerald Creich as Philip Barber, one half of the Barber Walker Coal Company and owner of Lamb Close. Reaction. Great description of the countryside as usual, an interesting plot line. But why, oh why, has he chosen to pick on Mr. Barber that way? The accidental deaths in the Barber family, one by a double-barrel gunshot, one by drowning, of 2 of his young children, do not contribute to the story, and the description of his father's death is disgusting. Why did he do that? Why indeed? Why indeed did they do that? Mildred Bennett quotes Willa Cather's description of all her fictional people as quoting, Mildred was quoting Willa, composites of 3 or 4 persons. I do not quite understand it, but certain persons seem to coalesce naturally when one is working up a story. I believe most authors shrink from actual portrait painting. It seems so cold-blooded, so heartless, so indecent. Almost to present an actual person in that intimate fashion stripping his very soul. Willa's own words: cold-blooded, heartless, indecent. Edith Lewis adds to this painting analogy in her book, quote, "I think she never set out to do a portrait of anyone as a portrait. Certain people suggested certain situations, came together in her mind in a composition that interested her. When it became necessary to change them in order to carry out a composition, she did so, much as a modern painter alters, modifies, suppresses certain features in his subject to suit his conception and his style. My Antonia and Mrs. Forrester," still quoting Edith, "my Antonia and Mrs. Forrester in The Lost Lady are closer, perhaps, to her remembrance of the actual people than any of her other character." Methinks Edith is being too kind. While she does point out that Willa did indeed wait for Governor Garber and his wife to die, claiming that it was a local newspaper obit forwarded to Willa in New York that triggered the novel, she knew well enough that the relatives of Mrs. Garber would be shocked and deeply offended by her portrayal in the later chapters. And deeply offended they were. In a 1973 letter from Charlotte Garber, Lyra's granddaughter, to Lonnie Dunbier, who we heard from yesterday, some of the pain is described and a possible reason for Mrs. Garber's treatment is given. Quoting from the letter: Miss Cather seldom saw and had little in common with my grandmother, and was cut off from the village life by her devoted care of her husband and their home property after his retirement following a brain injury accident. All our memories, including my mother's, let me go back. All our memories, including my mother's, have found Mrs. Forrester an almost complete stranger. The end of A Lost Lady is preposterous and equally remote from the facts, a complete fiction. Willa drew a reasonably accurate portrait of her personality, but the balance of the story was fiction to suit the plot which she was developing. And like most writers, she introduced the heroine's immoral conduct to interest a larger audience and make the book sell better. The discussions and gossip which followed after the publication of A Lost Lady, still quoting from the granddaughter's letter, were very distasteful and painful to those of us who had loved Mr. and Mrs. Garber, and the invasion of privacy would have been even more embarrassing to them. What were the comments that so upset the Garber descendants? Well, in discussing Ivy Peters' frequent visits to the Forrester place after the captain's funeral, Mrs. Forrester is described as, just a series of quotes here from the book, being like a ship without ballast, driven hither and thither by every wind. She was flighty and perverse. She seemed to have lost her faculty of discrimination, a power of easily and graciously keeping everyone in his proper place. Another quote: occasionally he took a friend or two, some of the town boys, over to dine at Mrs. Forrester's. The boys' mothers and sweethearts were greatly scandalized. Now she's after the young men, said Ed Elliott's mother. She's getting childish. Another quote: I know, she tossed her head. Her eyes glittered, but there was no mirth in them. It was more like hysterical defiance. I know they call me the Merry Widow. I rather like it. And the last quote. It was what he held most against Mrs. Forrester, that she was not willing to immolate herself like the widow of all these great men and die with the pioneer period to which she belonged, that she preferred life in her own terms, on any terms. In the end, Neil went away without bidding her goodbye. He went away with weary contempt for her in his heart. It happened like this. Ivy Peters came in at the kitchen door, walked up behind her, and unconcernedly put both arms around her, his hands meeting over her breast. She did not move, did not look up, but went on rolling out pastry. Ever since the captain's death, it was a house where old friends like his uncle were betrayed and cast off, where common fellows behaved after their kind and knew a common woman when they saw her. Edith tries to soften the impact by pointing out the malicious gossip in Red Cloud concerning the unusual visitors to the Garber's house. And while there is an arson theory that the Willow Shade sheep barn, and a Lyra made nasty comments about Willa's writing ability and appearance theory to explain Willa's retaliation, one must admit that Mrs. Forrester had to fall in order to complete the parallel with the passing of the noble homestead era. In Willa's own words, cold-blooded, heartless, and indecent. How does this all compare to Lawrence's writing? Well, in the game of persona plagiarism, DHL was a consummate professional, the master. Jesse Chambers, Lawrence's devoted friend from childhood through adolescence to early manhood, remembers his admiration for George Bellows, an English author. In fact, he spent a whole sunny Saturday evening up on Annesley Hills telling me about Burroughs' life. This is Jesse speaking, describing Lawrence, and about Lavengro, making the story so vivid that Burroughs seemed to be an actual acquaintance. He said that Burroughs had mingled autobiography and fiction so inextricably in Lavengro that the most astute critics could not be sure where one ended and the other began. From his subtle smile, I felt he was wondering whether he might not do something in the same fashion himself. Did he ever? Lawrence loved to caricature family, friends, and acquaintances, sometimes playfully, mostly vindictively. Much of his early work, due to the stifling influence of his mother, serves as a vehicle to vilify his father, coal mining, coal miners, coal mine owners, and even Eastwood, his birthplace. He had great difficulty in shaking off his working class upbringing and his hatred of industrialization's effects on human behavior. Only later in life did he regret the mistreatment he dealt his father and coal miners in general, much too little and much too late. In Women in Love, Lawrence also managed to insult his Bloomsbury friends, particularly Lady Ottiline Morell, whose husband threatened to sue Lawrence and his publisher unless changes were made. The whole incident is described in Louise de Salvo's book, Conceived with Malice, which illustrates the use of revenge as a creative impulse to produce literature, and shows that money is needed in order to fight the worst effects of persona plagiarism. Unfortunately, coal miners did not have that luxury. The Barber and Walker Company owned all the coal mines in and around Eastwood. Sir Thomas Philip Barber, shown in the picture, son of Thomas Barber, is featured in many of Lawrence's early novels. He and his home of Lamb Close appear in various disguises. In Women in Love, he is Gerald Creich and lives in Shortlands. Lawrence chose to illustrate his Women in Love novel with two incidents from the Barber's history, which contribute absolutely nothing to the storyline, but do assuage his revenge instinct. Kenneth Forbes Barber, 1877 to 90, 13 years old, was shot by his brother Philip when both were playing in the barn with an old double-barreled shotgun that no one knew was loaded. Cecily Frances Barber, 1886 to 92, just 6 years old, drowned in Moor Green Reservoir after falling from a boat along with a young man who attempted to save her, to rescue her. Both are buried at Greasley Church, not far from Lamb Close and the coal mines. Excerpts from Women in Love about the shooting. You know he shot his brother, said Ursula. Shot his brother, said Gudrun, frowning as if in disapprobation. Didn't you know? Oh, yes, I thought you knew. He and his brother were playing together with a gun. He told his brother to look down the gun, and it was loaded, and blew the top of his head off. Isn't it a horrible story? Perhaps there was a conscious will behind it, said Ursula. The playing at killing has some primitive desire for killing in it, don't you think? On the drowning, the bodies of the dead were not recovered till towards dawn. Diana had her arms tightly around the neck of the young man, choking him. She killed him, said Gerald. Do you think they are dead? She cried in a high voice to make herself heard. Yes, he replied. Isn't it horrible? He paid no heed. They walked up the hill further and further away from the noise. Do you mind very much? She asked him. I don't mind about the dead, he said. Once they're dead, once they're dead, the worst of it is they cling on to the living and won't let go. She pondered for a long time. Yes, she said, the fact of death doesn't really seem to matter much, does it? No, he said, what does it matter if Diana Crouch is alive or dead? On Thomas Barber's death, the father of Philip, his face was like yellow wax, his eyes darkened as it were sightless. His black beard, now streaked with grey, seemed to spring out of the waxy flesh of a corpse. Wah! Came a horrible, choking rattle from his father's throat. The fearful, frenzied eye, rolling awfully in his wild, fruitless search for help, passed blindly over Gerald, then up came the dark blood and mess pumping over the face of the agonized being. The tense body relaxed, the head fell aside down the pillow. The only words that come to mind are Willa's, cold-blooded, heartless, and indecent. Apart from his natural proclivity for caricature and his inbred hate for coal mine owners, Lawrence was carrying a particular grudge for Philip Barber. George Neville, Lawrence's perhaps only closest male friend through his youth into his early manhood, tells it this way in describing a falling out between Barber and Lawrence when returning home from the Hags, the farm where Jessie Chambers lived, his girlfriend. He was obviously very, very upset. But why? Because he was so damn snobbish, so damn rude and officious, he answered viciously. This is a quote from George Neville. I was coming across the fields and had got as far as the one by the riverside, reservoir side, when a man in a shooting suit with a gun under his armpit came up to me and said, well, who are you, and where do you think you're going? Here, Lawrence struck an attitude and adopted an accent in imitation of the way the question had been addressed to him. Except for the seriousness of the matter, it would have been quite humorous. I told him to go and mind his own damn business and that he could go to hell, he concluded. And then what? Oh, I don't know. He said something else and I got really angry and cursed him thoroughly. He told me he was a JP and could give me in charge for using bad language. I told him I knew nothing about him being a JP, but that I was quite certain he was a BF, and that he had my full permission to use these letters as well as his JP if he liked, and I walked away and left him. Damn snob. So what does all this talk about persona plagiarism mean for great literature? Certainly, there are many critics who believe that A Lost Lady and Women in Love represent some of the author's best writing. Many critics also believe that changing people and place names converts what would otherwise be biography, autobiography, or historical fiction into true fiction. Willa Cather is certainly guilty of what I would call minor persona plagiarism in A Lost Lady, in that only a few direct members of the Garber family and close acquaintances in Red Cloud would have been shocked. It is in no way as severe as her vilification of Padre Antonio Jose Martinez of Taos, who had perhaps thousands of Spanish followers in Mexico and New Mexico. But more on that next year when we celebrate the 100th anniversary of my favorite Cather novel, Death Comes for the Archbishop. With regard to D.H. Lawrence, I tend to agree with Professor F.B. Pinion, who blamed Lawrence's inner conflicts for outbreaks of hatred and aggressiveness in his literature and his life. Quoting Pinion, people he knew provided convenient copy, and there were many whom he chose to present falsely for fictional ends. This proclivity suggests not only a willful meanness, but a creative shortcoming. Pretty strong. Only a spiteful anti-bourgeois humor can explain the naming of his famed de classe heroine Constance Chatterley, daughter of the secretary and estate agent for the Barbara Walker Company, who lived at the Hollies in Eastwood and traveled daily to school in Nottingham on the same train as Lawrence. Lawrence's awareness of the victim-victimizer complex grew from the reactions of his own passional self. So, in my opinion, great literature is in the eye of the beholder and is strongly influenced by the context in which the author wrote it. I tend to think that authors would prefer you to read their literature first and worry, if ever, about the context in which it was written. What do you think? Have you been through this? I'd love to hear from you if you've got personal opinions about that. Is it best to read the author first and then the biography, or should you know something about the author before you read the literature? So I'll close with this slide. Because context is so important, I would truly like to see both Willa Cather's birthplace in Back Creek, Virginia, and the Hagg's Farm just outside Eastwood, belonging to the Barber family. I would love to see them restored back to their original condition so that we can expand on the context. I should mention that the Hagg's Farm is kind of collateral damage from the Barber Lawrence falling out, because the owners simply are letting it, they call it rewilding. They're going to return it back to its original condition. Thank you.
Close this. Okay. Now let's get positioned here. We're looking for a little light, but we'll do the best we can. My aim in these brief comments is to consider the significance of the 7 words at the end of the final sentence of the second paragraph of A Lost Lady cited in my title. The full sentence, which serves as an introduction to Captain Daniel Forrester, reads as follows. Captain Forrester was himself a railroad man, a contractor who had built hundreds of miles of road for the Burlington, over the sagebrush and cattle country and on up into the Black Hills. Most discussions of the novel make no mention of these words, or if they do, say nothing further about them. Furthermore, discussions of Silas Garber, the husband of Lyra Wheeler Garber, the primary model for Forrester's wife, Marion, the title figure of the novel, seldom note that Garber who is credited with laying out the town of Red Cloud in 1871 and naming it to honor a then prominent leader of the Oglala Lakota, was, as the entry on him in the Reader's Companion to the Fiction of Willa Cather makes clear, not himself a railroad man. Cather, in her depiction of the captain, thus, according to Carrie Ronnie's explanatory notes to the scholarly edition of the novel, likely drew upon the figure of John Fitzgerald of Lincoln, a contractor with banking interests who laid most of the Burlington tracks built in Nebraska and into the Black Hills before his death in 1895. Cather did not then have to include reference to the construction of the Burlington on up into the Black Hills when introducing her readers to the captain, or to describe him as a railroad man. But she did, and as Merrill Skaggs writes, when Cather allows an apparently casual allusion to remain in her text, she does so because it has and serves a purpose. So what are we to make of these references, which together with other references to the Black Hills and to Indians in the remainder of the text are surely not casual? I must say before addressing this question that I think it important not to emphasize too much the 7 words cited in my title, but to ignore them entirely surely leads to interpretations that fail to do justice to the complexity of the novel. I offer then less a radically new analysis of the novel than one that, while drawing on the commentaries of Joseph Ergo, Janice Stout, and Wendy Perriman, who do all take these 7 words seriously, also draws on the foundational work of Joanne Middleton, Richard Giannone, and Susan Rosowski, who do not. I want first then to briefly indicate what I find instructive in the work of each of these commentators. Why didn't Cather make more of matters alluded to by these 7 words than she did? Because as Ergo suggests when implicitly responding to this question, she didn't have the sensibility of a Tolstoy or Dickens. She could, he explains, have poured into the vacuoles of the book the economic details of Captain Forrester's road-making generation. His railroad project into the Black Hills might make a volume filled with details about sacred grounds, broken treaties, and the boy general George Armstrong Custer. For emphasis, I might add to Ergo's words the 2 short sentences that Guy Reynolds offers in his early work on Death Comes for the Archbishop to account for the way in which Cather made use of historical context in that novel, which also applies to Lost Lady. Cather eschews the dramatic foreground of history. Her novels portray the hinterland of history. It covers the quotidian background. And then added to that, Cather had, after all, read Carlyle, Michelet, Parkman, and she knew Homer and Virgil well, but her interests are best described as aesthetic, not those of a historian or of an epic poet. I draw second from Stout, who challenges the inference that many take from the novel that Captain Forrester's acquisition of the land near Sweetwater, on which he built his house, is somehow morally less objectionable than Ivy Peters' acquisition of land in Wyoming after passage of the General Allotment Act of 1887, which is explained in the explanatory notes, proposed to end communal or shared use of reservation land and make Native Americans independent farmers by allotting to each head of family 160 acres of reservation land and 40 additional acres to each miner. But, as Stout writes, the fact of the matter is that both men got their land from the Indians. If Ivy's dealings were rascality, why were Daniel Forrester so different? Having first seen the site of his future home when it was an Indian encampment, he had driven willow stakes into the ground to mark the location and returned after helping to lay the first railroad across the plains to buy the property from the railroad, which had in the meantime acquired that splendid land from the Indians through a process of national appropriation and distribution, a process no less exploitive than the Ivy Peters methods. I draw then third on the parallels between the ghost dance ceremonies of the late 19th century Lakota, who regarded the Black Hills as sacred lands, as their descendants still do, and Marion Forrester's love of dance that Wendy Perriman brings to her commentary on the novel. For the Lakota, as Perriman explains, the ghost dance provided an opportunity to experience a mystical contact with their dead loved ones, and in the words of a specialist, rescue them from their misery and to restore to them their old way of life. Perriman's suggestion is then that just as the ghost dance effectively represented the end of the Sioux Nation, Cather seems to have appropriated this idea and superimposed it on the decline of the Golden Pioneer. For it was a suppression of the ghost dance that led to the December 29, 1890 massacre at Wounded Knee, which the Oglala Sioux or Black Elk later described as the place where A people's dream died, a beautiful dream. So when Marianne dances, she too, like those participating in the ghost dance ceremonies, is connected to a social order that is dying. Perriman concludes then that when Captain Forrester speaks of with the lonely, defiant note that is so often heard of the voices of the old Indians, it sounds like the Native Americans represent his awareness of how the events of history result in the displacement of cultures, the older order invariably giving way to the new. What, on the other hand, about the work of the three commentators whose scholarship I have referred to as foundational, Middleton, Giannoni, and Rosowski? My respect for the work of Middleton has already been acknowledged by the inclusion of the term vacuole in the citation from Ergo. My respect for Giannoni will be evident in the brief analysis of the novel that follows, where I frame my reading of the text as if it were a musical score, as described below. My respect for the work of Rosowski, however, evident in my title, cannot be indicated so briefly. Rosowski is, of course, well known for her emphasis on the romantic in Cather's fiction. I like then how she contrasts this novel with the one published the previous year. One of ours, she writes, was a detailed narrative about a young romantic search for something splendid, a dissolution of tradition, while A Lost Lady is this search, so poetic that reading it is akin to reading a Keatsian ode. What Rosowski does not, however, in her exemplary discussion of the novel, feel in it is that feature of romantic art that she valorizes only in her analysis of Cather's final two novels, Lucy Gayheart and Sapphira and the Slave Girl, cited in my title, The Gothic. For the purpose of these remarks, Rosowski's account of the Gothic element in romantic literature will suffice and might be briefly summarized as follows. The most memorable passage of Cather's novel, she writes, present moments of transcendence which affirm that universal truths exist and that through the imagination we can experience them. The examples of this experience she cites are then from earlier works, Alexander Bergson joining with the genius of The Divide, Thea Kronberg uniting with art in Panther Canyon, and Jim Burden recognizing Antonia as a mythic earth mother. But, as she emphasized in the first sentence of the next paragraph, the extreme intensity of the romantic impulse towards resolution suggests a fear that final revelations may be denied and universal truth unattainable. Citing G. Richard Thompson, she then describes the Gothic as follows. The Gothic is the dark counterforce to optimistic romanticism because it begins with irreconcilable dualities and as a form acknowledges the triumph of paradox and ambiguity, the impossibility of ultimate synthesis. Of the Gothic element in A Lost Lady, she offers, however, only two brief telling observations. The first, and in my view the more problematic, is that in this novel, the noble pioneer Captain Forrester is replaced by one of the purest grotesques in American fiction, the reptilian Ivy Peters, who wields power over Marion Forrester. The second observation begins then by crediting Maximilian Novak with this additional feature of the Gothic. The demons of the Gothic, real, imagined, or fabricated, represent a sudden revelation of the uncontrolled forces of the mind as they are reified in the seemingly ordered real world. The significance that Rosowski gives to these words for the analysis of A Lost Lady is as follows. Before A Lost Lady, Cather characteristically placed the irrational in external events and people. A constantly evil Wick Cutter threatens a constantly good Antonia. But beginning with A Lost Lady, Cather presents within characters capacities for transformation. Marion Forrester's lovely laugh could suddenly become mocking, and beneath her gracious manner lay uncontrolled passion. I think, however, that while Rosowski is correct in focusing on Marion Forrester's laughter, this analysis does not nearly go so deep, this analysis does not go nearly deep enough to identify the darkness that chills me when I read the novel. But I suspect, I must say, that my reading is shaped significantly by the fact that while my parents were raised and are now buried in a cemetery of a small town about 50 miles northeast of Red Cloud, we lived in Gordon, Nebraska, about 15 miles south of Wounded Knee from the mid-1950s through the early 1960s. I went then in the following brief analysis to contrapose Cather's descriptions of Marion's laughter with references both to the Black Hills and to Indians. Framing the text of the novel in terms of a musical score, I hear Marion's laughter as a recurring but changing leitmotif written in the upper register of the scale, and references to the Black Hills and to Indians as slightly discordant discordant sounding bass notes or perhaps pedal tones, hence unsettling, but I must emphasize ultimately indeterminate in reference. Focusing on Marian's laugh is, of course, fully consistent with Rosowski's emphasis on the positive romantic pedigree of the novel. That her laughter is perceived as a defining feature of Marian's personality is confirmed by the description of it in the concluding section of the text, when Ed Elliot is telling Neil about his encounter with her in Buenos Aires. I was, Ed tells Neil, in South America on business. I'm a mining engineer. I spent time in Buenos Aires. One evening there was a banquet of some sort at one of the big hotels, and I happened to step out of the bar just as a car drove up at to the entrance where the guests were going in. I paid no attention until one of the ladies laughed. I recognized her by her laugh. That hadn't changed a particle. The first mention of Marian's laughter appears in sections 1-3, when it is contrasted with the bleakness of the opening paragraphs of this section, in which we are informed of the accident which cut short the captain's career as a road builder, that the town's future no longer looked bright, that Neil's father was one of the first failures to be crowded to the wall, and that his father had left for Denver to accept an office position. Neil first experiences Marian's laughter then as a distraction from being bored with the notes he was copying in the service of his lawyer uncle. The passage reads as follows. Neil was trying to invent excuses for getting out in the street when he became aware of light footsteps coming rapidly down the outside corridor. The door of the office opened. He heard his uncle quickly rise to his feet, and at the same time he heard a woman's laugh, a soft, musical laugh which rose high and descended like a suave scale. The connection between Marian's laugh and her love of dance, emphasized by Perriman, is suggested by the next mention of laughter in the same section of the novel. Neil is depicted as comparing the presence of Marian with the women he has seen in Denver in the dining room of the Brown Palace Hotel, coming down to dinner, fashionable women from the East on their way to California. Compared with her, however, Neil finds other women heavy and dull. Even the pretty ones seem lifeless. They had not that something in their glance that made one's blood tingle, and never elsewhere had he heard anything like her inviting musical laugh. That was like the distant measure of dance music heard through the opening and shutting of doors. The final indisputably positive romantic presentation of Marian's laughter in part 1 of the novel appears then in section 1-6. The section following the account of Marian's and Frank's sleigh ride into the woods were, however, they observed by the Blum boy and not by Neil. The first of the two mentions of Marian's laughter in this section appear in the final sentence of the third paragraph. Nothing, Cather writes, now in the voice of an omniscient narrator, pleased one more than to provoke Marian's laughter. Then you felt you were getting on with her. It was her form of communicating, of agreeing with you and appreciating you when you said something interesting. And it often told you a great deal that was both too direct and too elusive for words. These sentences are then followed by a new paragraph that focuses on Marian's laugh that is clearly pivotal for any interpretation of the text. Long, long afterward, when Neil did not know whether Mrs. Forrester was living or dead, if her image flashed into his mind, it came with the brightness of dark eyes, her pale triangular cheeks with long earrings, and her many-colored laugh. When he was dull and tired of everything, he used to think that if he could hear that long-lost lady laugh, he could be gay. This, the romantic promise of Marian's laugh, is then reprised in the final section of the novel. The passage reads as follows. It was years before Neil could think of Mrs. Forrester without chagrin. But eventually, after she had drifted out of his ken, when he did not know if Daniel Forrester's wife were living or dead, Daniel Forrester's wife returned to him a bright, impersonal memory. Her eyes, when they laughed for a moment into one's own, seemed to promise a wild delight that he had not found in life. The life-affirming power of these laughing eyes is then celebrated one last time in the final sentence of the subsequent paragraph, prior to Ed Elliott's report of his encounter with the remarried Mrs. Forrester and her death. Neil is described as wondering if Mrs. Forrester had really found some ever-blooming, ever-burning, ever-piercing joy, or whether it was all fine play acting. But even if, he concludes, she had found no more than another, she had always the power of suggesting things much lovelier than herself, as the perfume of a single flower may call up the whole sweetness of spring. All these counts, however, recall only Neil's favorable perceptions and memories of the lady. but as Rosowski recognized his other experience of Mrs. Forrester's laughter that he would like to give less credence to because they link her to the two men in her life other than the captain, Frank Elliger and Ivy Peters, and the darker Gothic powers that they do indeed exhibit. The first time that Marian's laughter is paired with such darkness is when Neil first hears her laughter, and then Frank's when he approaches the house with the flowers that he wants to give her after the captain had traveled together with Judge Pomeroy to Denver, where he is informed that the bank in which he is an officer has failed. This passage reads as follows. As Neil bent to place the flowers on the hill, he heard from within a woman's soft laughter, impatient, indulgent, teasing, eager, then another laugh, very different, a man's, and it was fat and lazy, ended in something like a yawn. The passage in which Marian's laughter is similarly paired with that of Ivy Peters appears early in part 2 of the novel, 2-3, after Neil has returned from Boston, but even before Frank marries Constance Ogden and Marian's late-night call to him at the Hantlers Hotel in Colorado Springs. This passage reads as follows. One morning, as Neil was coming up through the Foresters' Grove, he heard laughter by the gate, and there he saw Ivy with his gun, talking with Mrs. Forrester. She was bareheaded, her skirts blowing in the wind. He was telling her a funny story, perhaps an improper one, for it brought out her nastiest laugh, with something nervous and excited in it as if he were going too far. At the end of his story, Ivy himself broke into a farmhand guffaw. So while Marian's laughter can have an uplifting, transcendent power, when paired with that of Frank and Ivy, it sounds in a different, lower register and becomes common, if not discordant. We must, however, turn now from passages that provide images of Marian's laughter to those that make reference to the Black Hills or to Indians. There are, of course, fewer such references after the initial reference to the Black Hills in the first section of the novel. I think, however, that their significance can be shown by focusing on the way in which Marian offers her own story about her life, about how she met and married the captain during the second dinner party that takes place near the end of section 2-7. The first of these references appears in the captain's account at the first dinner party of how he came to find the location in which he built his house. Prompted by his wife's request that he tell Constance Ogden about how you first found this lovely spout, way back in Indian times, the captain recounts how after serving in the Civil War, he had taken a job as a driver for a freighting company that carried supplies across the plains from Nebraska City to Cherry Creek. The account continues. Once, when he was driven out of the trail by a washout, he had ridden on his horse to explore and found an Indian encampment near the Sweetwater. He was, he said, greatly taken up by the location and made up his mind that he would one day have a house there. He later returned and bought the place from the railroad company, which, he adds, took his note. There is, however, significant incongruity in how the captain's storytelling is described at this point in the narrative and how he is himself described after he concludes. The sentence at the end of the paragraph just cited reads, something in the way he uttered his unornamented phrases gave them the impressiveness of inscriptions cut in stone. A few paragraphs later, the captain makes the declaration that figures prominently in most accounts of the novel. A thing that is dreamed in the way I mean, he says, admonishing Constance and Neil to become dreamers, is already accomplished. Then after a brief pause, prompted by Marian, he continues, all our great West has been developed from such dreams, the homesteaders and the prospectors and the contractors. We dreamed the railroads across the mountains, just as I dreamed my place in Sweetwater. All these things will be everyday facts to the coming generation, but to us, there's a break in the text, followed by the next reference to Indians, which emphasized by Harriman reads as follows. Captain Forrester ended with a sort of grunt. Something forbidden had come into his voice, the lonely, defiant note that is so often heard in the voices of old Indians, an oral image that hardly fits with the earlier visual description of his unornamented phrases as having the impressiveness of inscriptions cut in stone. The next two references to the Black Hills or the Indians appear in section 2-3. The first of these comes after Neil sits down with the captain to talk after he has criticized the behavior of Ivy Peters, saying that fellow hasn't the manners of a pig. The conversation turns then to a long talk about the building of the railroad of the Black Hills branch of the Burlington. The conversation provides Neil with an opportunity to tell the captain about a conversation he had had the previous winter in Boston with an old mine owner who was living in Deadwood when the railroad first came in. There is, of course, in this conversation, no discussion of the historical events which made it possible for people such as this man to become a mine owner after the Lakota had been unjustly pressured into selling the Black Hills in 1877. But it does provide the two of them an occasion to praise Marianne for her beauty, for the only thing that the mine owner remembers about the captain is that he was the one with a beautiful wife. The conversation in which Marianne insists that she does not admire people who cheat Indians comes in only a few pages later. Cather has made clear, however, that Marianne has spent time in the Black Hills. Significant, too, is that after Marianne tells her story at the second dinner party, Neil remembers that the first time he ever heard her tell the story was when Mr. Dalzell had stopped off with a party of friends from Chicago, including Marshall Field and the president of the Union Pacific, who were going through in Mr. Dalzell's private car to hunt in the Black Hills. So while Marianne may profess to have standards for judging the actions of individual men, she clearly has none for evaluating the actions of government that made possible the acquisition of the land enjoyed by both the captain and Ivy Peters, as well as that of the Deadwood mine owner, or that which made it possible for Dalzell and his friends to hunt in the Black Hills, presumably without Lakota escorts. I turn finally, however, to suggest how the way in which Cather presents Marianne's telling of the story about how she met the captain at the second dinner party can be reread as bringing together these seemingly disparate motifs, her musical laughter and references to the Black Hills or to Indians. Marianne begins her story with the words, well, once upon a time, when I was a very young girl, I was spending the summer at a camp in the mountains with friends of my father's. But her telling of the story is immediately broken by the authorial report that Neil had long ago heard from his uncle that the real beginning was a scandal and a murder. The report Neil had from his uncle reads as follows. When Marianne Orsby was 19, she was engaged to Ned Montgomery, a gaudy young millionaire of the Gold Coast. A few weeks before their marriage, Mary Montgomery was shot and killed in the lobby of a San Francisco hotel by the husband of another woman. The subsequent trial involved a great deal of publicity, and Marianne was hurried away from the curious eyes and sent up into the mountains until the affair should blow over. Should we not then draw an analogy between how Marianne tells her story, leaving out the scandal and murder that came before the captain rescues her after her fall when descending the face of Eagle Cliff with the young, intrepid mountain climber Fred Harney, marries her and subsequently brings her to live with him in Sweetwater, and the story that Cather is telling about Mrs. Forrester, which also fails to include the details of all the scandal and murder that predated the founding of the town and the building of the railroad on up into the Black Hills. Details not named in the novel, but empty spaces, vacuoles that Middleton's fine reader must fall in for himself. Neil, of course, only knows what he knows about Marianne's life because he has learned it from an independent source, his uncle, not from the story as Marianne tells it. Readers of A Lost Lady are in a similar position regarding historical events predating the founding of Sweetwater and the construction of the Burlington on up into the Black Hills. If they have not been told the many backstories by someone, they can, however, now very easily do the research for themselves. I conclude these remarks, however, only by briefly sketching a few implications my reading might have for further commentary on the novel. First, my reading supports the work of those who read the novel not as a simply mythic fairy tale glorification of, but as a source for criticism of the patriarchal order of the era in which the captain is portrayed as exemplary. Second, my reading offers a serious response to Dorothy Van Kent's famous criticism that the prose in Cather's description of the Old West and the Lost Lady was cliché and the thought specious, diffuse, and sentimental. Namely, why not read these passages with a bit of irony? Third, my reading encourages further comparison of Cather's novel with Shakespeare's Tempest, as suggested by Stout over 2 decades ago. For just as The Tempest can now be read as a founding text of both Romanticism and English colonialism, can we now not read A Lost Lady as both a classic text of Romanticism as well as a stimulus for civil, open-ended reflection on the legacy of American settler colonialism on the Great Plains? Stout, of course, did not fully develop this approach when he suggested it, and I've come to the end of my allotted time, so I offer it now only as a topic for further discussion.
So my sense is that we're having lunch in 5 minutes, and I intend to entertain you for 5 minutes. Shall I do 5 minutes? Got to do 10? Oh, I don't. Well, we have to have lunch. Well, we'll see. I'm crossing out pieces. Let's go. My title is. Thank you both. Good morning, and I will try to condense as I go. My title is called. It comes from the film, the recent film, the Academy Award-winning film, Everything, Everywhere, All at Once, and now I'm going to do it. Okay, so here it goes. First, plagiarism. It is a truth universally acknowledged that Willa Cather, having dipped into a Nebraska newspaper in possession of an idea for some new piece of fiction, must have been in want of a prototype. Or 2, or 3, or 6, or 12, and that was Jane Austen, but it fits prototypes just as well. I have a very sanguine approach to prototypes. In fact, I love prototypes, so I believe they can be cold-hearted and mean and cruel, but the thrust of my paper is to make a plea for the power of prototypes, the fun of prototypes. I'm condensing here very quickly. Of course, I'm speaking about the way Cather liked to conjure up characters based on real people, but you know, as we all do, that prototypes also exist as Red Cloud is a prototype, of course. Towns can be prototypes. Things can be prototypes. Having admitted that acknowledged truth about Cather in search of a prototype, I think we have to admit that some people, and let's admit it that some people, even perhaps some of you, don't like prototypes. Or, as a dear friend of mine once explained to me, I think they're boring. Still, there are those of us who love prototypes. Why love a prototype? I think some of us will go on loving prototypes because they contain little mysteries, which look a lot like the mysteries we find in gossip, in good gossip. And Tracy Tucker you alluded to this with Lonnie yesterday. And the reality is gossip's pretty darn entertaining. In the scholarly edition of The Lost Ladies, Susan Rosowski and Carrie Ronning offer another reason to love prototypes when they talk about the game of identifying people in one of Cather's novels. It is a game. It's not unlike Trivial Pursuits, for instance. It's one of those games that's even more interesting because it involves memory. All those twists and turns, what we remember, what we don't remember, and how we compare our memory. Here's an even better reason to love prototypes, and this is really my main argument of the day. Everything else gets a little flaky from this point on, okay? Years ago, the Shakespeare scholar Howard Felpern argued that a criticism founded on the way the playwright changed details in his sources was the surest way to appreciate the playwright's genius. Let him steal the story from someone else, but let's see what he changes, and then you'll see the genius at work. I think this notion, it leads to the best argument for loving prototypes in Willa Cather's fiction. Studying Cather's transformation of prototypes helps us understand and appreciate her craft. This is the way we begin moving beyond traditional prototypes. With all that in mind, I want to explore Cather's use of boy prototypes in A Lost Lady. My hypothesis is that boy prototypes, the real boys that populate the novel. And remember, Captain Forster, he has to tell his story. Part of his story of his past is his boy story of coming out west. So we're talking about a much larger group than just the boys I'm going to mention in a moment. That Cather's use of boy prototypes allowed Cather to create surprisingly sophisticated narrative effects that lead us from the Red Cloud universe of her youth to a kind of multiverse. And there I said it. This is where people begin to leave for lunch right now. He's actually standing on the stage talking about multiverses. How many people right now, if you had to, could you define a multiverse? What is a multiverse? Raise your hand, multiverse people. See, that's what I thought. I knew this would excite you. So the thing about the multiverse is that I want to stress is that the multiverse right now, it sounds like physics. People who love their Star Trek, or people who love Everything Everywhere All at Once. People who love science fiction, they treat multiverses as though they've been proven by physics, that there's a theory of physics at work here. Of course, it's not been proven. It's a nifty mythology is what it is that's rooted in physics. And so my pitch to you today is that the multiverse, what Cather's doing, insofar as I'm talking about a multiverse today, is she's simply doing mythology again. And I'm taking a contemporary idea, the multiverse, and here I'm talking about the idea that at any given moment, how to put this exactly, that there is in fact an infinite number of other universes existing simultaneously with us. And we have our counterparts across all those universes. Okay? So the way we play this game is this is another one of those thought experiments. I'm going to shrink it. Just take a second and think about the most important moment in your life. Maybe it's a graduation. Maybe it's when you got married. Maybe it's when you didn't get married. But you're thinking about a really important moment. Now, let's assume it didn't happen. Who are you sitting there today? Are you the same person? This is a form of, as my philosopher buddy Alan Hart always says, this is coulda, shoulda, woulda. You know, if only I'd won that award, I would have been a contender or something like that. But then we got to add another piece to it to really do the multiverse mythology. The multiverse mythology is not just that all these choices lead to different versions of yourself, but what if sitting there right now, as you're seeing Tom, seeing you sitting there looking very comfortably, what if another Tom walks in right now, and I mean like another version of you? What do you say? The answer? Any New Yorker can tell you, how you doing? And I guess the other you says, how you doing, right? What do you do when you meet the other parts of the universe, and then how would you judge? How would you work out your relationships? That's the core premise, the founding premise of this film I'm referring to, Everything Everywhere All at Once. My leap mythologically into Cather is, I think that Cather gets to create a similar set of similar effects because she works with prototypes in the particular way she works with prototypes. All right, I'm just about done with the paper. I think I can almost just pull a thread and tie it. Let's begin with the novel's memorable second paragraph with Mrs. Forrester, and now I'm just going to catch you up, right? This is that great second paragraph. A group of little boys coming along the driveway, barefoot, with fishing poles and lunch baskets. She knew most of them. There was Neil Herbert, and remember, she now the narrator begins to name the boys. Well, all of you who have studied the novel, you know perfectly well that these boys are modeled on prototypes, Red Cloud prototypes. And if you go to what I refer to in my study as the Green Book, which is the John March volume of that entire wonderful catalog, a big volume like this, right, of all the real life references and then their versions in Cather's fiction. If you go to that book, you can track all of these down. If you get the scholarly edition of A Lost Lady, Carrie Ronning is a fellow fan of prototypes, probably the grand wizardess of prototypes, and she can add to your knowledge of who those boys are. But the key thing to remember is the way that last little bit of the paragraph there, as they paused before the 3 steps which led to the front porch, Mrs. Forster came to the door and nodded graciously, one of the pink roses in her hand. Good morning, boys. Off for a picnic? Now, take all of the boys together, and some are more important than others. We know that Ryland Dillard Bedford seems to have been the prototype for Neil. Talk about that. But today, I'm mostly interested in the Bloom boys, little German boys, Reinhold and Adolf, you will recall in the novel, who are modeled on the sons of German tailor Fritz Berkner. Hermann Fritz Karl and Reinhardt, known as Rhein, were the names of the real sons. By using Rhein's name in the story, Cather seems to call out, hey, here's a prototype, check this out. And I mean, she's naming the actual person. That's pretty clear there. There's no great mystery involved with this. What she doesn't foreground is that she's already moving beyond prototypes. According to the OED, the term first appeared in 1552 and refers to the first or primary type of person or thing, an original on which something is modeled, or from which it's derived. It's an archetype. From the first, we've thought about prototypes as dyadic. We tend to think about them as, there's the original, and here's this new transformation. But the boys in A Lost Lady, in addition to having real-world counterparts, are modeled on characters in Cather's early short fiction that were modeled already on those prototypes. You feel the multiplication happening. And yes, I'm talking about parallel universes, not just the same, not that it's the same character in sequels of some kind, but multiple different works of art that clearly are rippling back with versions of the original prototype. And the 3 stories that really do this, you can trace this for yourself if you want, and I highly recommend that you go back to some of the early fiction. I do that a lot in my book, Becoming Willa Cather, and this is where I'm supposed to say, by the way, it's for sale in the bookstore, and you can, and I'll sign anything, any part of it for you, it'll be fine. But some of the early fiction that we never get to usually, because we get stuck reading the Wagner matinee, the Wagner matinee, for instance, or we read Paul's Case again. Well, those are great stories, but some of the earlier fiction is fabulous. So the stories you want for this purpose, for this little experiment, what time? How much time do I have? I'm still within the new? Okay, I can do it. All right. The stories you want are The Way of the World, that's 1898, The Treasure of Far Island, which is 1902, and then the one that you all know, I'm sure, The Enchanted Bluff of 1909. The fascinating thing is these boys that pop up in A Lost Lady, 1923, these boys have all popped up in those stories. And as they do so, my basic argument is that as they do so, if you can read them and hold them together, you see a kind of multi-perspectivity, if you will. You see a possibility for becoming, for being multiple in ways that I think were crucial to Cather's writing. We've talked a lot as Cather folks, we talk a lot about Cather's love of the double life, and it even pops up in A Lost Lady. Neil, remember during the summer there, that fateful summer, he's kind of living that double life. I think Cather really, that doesn't begin to describe what Cather really loved and what her art is really offering us. She's offering us a multiple life. She's suggesting that you can find in these multiple parallel universes of her stories, you can find all sorts of options for being who you want to be. Let me drop to this then. I'll conclude with this. And nothing less than gender fluidity, I think, is actually at stake in this multi-perspectivity. I want to give you a little extra weight here. Think about Ivy Peters' arrival. "Hello, kids. What are you doing here?" "Picnic," said Ed Elliott. "I thought girls went on picnics. Did you bring teacher along? Ain't you kids old enough to hunt yet?" Ivy Peters poisons dogs and tortures birds. But he signals his true status as a villain by taunting the boys about the way they do and don't conform to gender expectations. In their prototypical existence, they embody multiple possibilities for being masculine, for being male. They embody those, in fact, across the various stories as they grow older and take and seize other opportunities. Ivy never will get that, and Ivy is a villain. In fact, this possibility, this valuing of multi-possibilities and multiple lives, was at the very heart of Cather's compositional process. In that famous New York interview of 1925, she explained, "A Lost Lady was written in 5 months, but I worked with some fervor. I discarded ever so many drafts, and in the beginning wrote it in the first person, speaking as the boy himself." I think we know what she meant by speaking as the boy himself. She was trying to write a first-person novel with Neil as the narrator, but I'd like to suggest that all the boy life underpinning in the text, all that underpainting, the shifting boy gaze, if you will, looking through boys' eyes, speaking as boys, all of that allows the author to speak as the boys themselves. In this way, A Lost Lady is a gift from the boys, which is exactly what Reinhold Berkner, the real Ryan, said when he brought a bunch of roses and roses, to the Minor household after Julia had died. I think we hunger ultimately for stories of the multiverse because we feel, as Cather felt, that our lives are deeply, profoundly multiple, and real happy days come from that multiplicity. That's a book. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was the best, shortest paper ever given probably here. Well done. Yes. All of our bellies who are hungry appreciate it. That was a different multiverse, right? If we had multiverse now, we would have more time maybe, or, right? We'd all have eaten lunch. We have a few questions if you all for it. Yeah? You all right? We'll begin with Daryl. We'll begin with you. Weren't prototypes a lot like persona plagiarism? People are very much alike in several stereotypical ways. Again, you can Only write about people you know, and people fall into definable prototypes.
Yes, I think, I'm have to get used to this. Yes, I think that persona plagiarism, that term, I think we're talking about the same thing. Obviously, there's a pejorative quality, and if you say plagiarism, then you're suggesting that somehow something's being stolen or something like that. And so you can feel, I think prototypes are pretty fun to talk about because you can feel people get worked up about prototypes, don't they? And I'm perfectly happy to see whatever Cather does with real people in her novels, but if it was my mother in that novel, I might be offended in some fashion. So I don't know. I think that answers the question, right? It's just, yeah.
Great,
Yeah,
thank you.
something like that.
For John, what composer might you imagine creating your piece of music using Marion's laughter and the gothic darkness of the Black Hills as motifs? What composer might you imagine creating your piece of music?
Because it's still on, right? Well, I mean, the first references, of course, is to Wagner. I mean, that's the illusion, okay, and Giannoni and such. And then there's that great little piece by not John but Joe Murphy on a Wagner matinee, in which he talks about how Wagner was loved in America, and we know that Cather loved Wagner and all. So that's who you think of. But when I think about this as a musical composition, and I want to say I do that in part because when I read the Cather novels, which might be the experience you all have, it's like listening to a piece of music that you know really, really well. And then you come to a certain point in the book and you get the feeling that she wants you to get, and it happens every damn time, and it's better every time, like listening to music. So, I mean, that's really my inspiration for this. And whether there's a composer other than Wagner, I'm, you know, I hate to use the Wagnerian phrase, music of the future, but I don't know who the composer would be now that I think about it. I want to say one other thing about that. And when we listen to music, we generally don't want it to be political, right? Okay, that would destroy it if it was political. And I think it's the same case with this book, but that doesn't mean that there can't be things in it that draw attention to other sort of reflection. Okay, is that
Great, yeah, thank you. And then we have one last question for you, Bill. One can only bring out of their mind what has gone into the mind. So using characters of real people is inevitable and should that be expected. Do you agree? It's another question for you about prototypes and plagiarism. So in other words, like, Bill? Yeah. Yeah, sure. Sorry. It might have a little bit of a question of can you really write outside of a prototype because you can't live right outside what you know? Yeah?
I'm going to cheat. I'm going to go back to plagiarism. Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm going to go back to plagiarism here because I cut it very quickly at the very beginning of my paper. You could certainly quote Cather herself, who complained that, remember there's the famous complaint she writes to Carrie Minor Sherwood. She says, you can never get it through people's heads that a story is made out of an emotion or an excitement and is not made out of the legs and arms and faces of one's acquaintances. But Cather did right sheet, and so that's that famous response there. But she needed to say that, didn't she? Because she knew that people, of course she knew, we've agreed on that over the last day or so, that she knew that people are going to be upset and all of that. So that's a powerful thing, justification. I think we call that in literary terminology a rationalization. And you can't get through life without those. So that's what that is. But our old friend Tim Bintram, actually in a recent article, he quotes that and then comes back and responds to Cather and says, of course scholars know better. Serious readers can both appreciate the aesthetics of Cather's fiction and discern the legs and arms and faces of her friends and acquaintances and casual acquaintances that more often than not provided that initial emotion or excitement. Tim is wise, Tim is good, but the fact remains that some folks will still object to the prototypes.
I'm not sure that one can only bring out what has gone in, as a basic premise. I suppose it's somewhat true. Certainly, obviously, authors tend to write about context. The context that they live in is what they write about, certainly. I suppose my point is that different authors have different reasons for writing about certain people in their work, and it's those reasons that determine, whether it's really great literature or not. That's what I tried to show in those two examples, that there's kind of ulterior motives in many authors' minds in terms of writing about real people, and I think that's part of the problem. And I'm not sure it's not possible to write about something that has not gone in. I think you can. I mean, that's the amazing thing about the human mind, is that it can develop things that have never been developed before. It's creativity, called creativity.
Great. On that note, oh wait, we have one more point.
I think this is working now. Yeah, I do want to come back to one last thing, which is related to that too, and that is that great conversation that Tracy had with Lonnie yesterday. If you heard that, yeah. And if I understood Lonnie correctly, and Tracy can correct me later, as you would want to do, yeah. But if I understood correctly, so Lonnie tells the story about becoming obsessed with studying the Garber family, and she came out to Red Cloud, right, not having read A Lost Lady yet. She hadn't read the novel, but they went out to the old Garber place, and she saw the ruins, and she realized she was obsessed with the prototype of the Garbers. She hadn't read the novel yet. Isn't that interesting? That desire, that interest in prototypes, it's even before the art itself, that craft and wonder that Cather made so well and did so well with Lost Lady. That's my last comment.
Great, thank you. Have a great lunch.